In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Bleu Lagoon. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. A lighter blue turquoise with a bit of a turquoise blue lean, just a bit. It should easily pass in a professional environment as a blue unless you're writing on yellow Rhodia paper. Then see what's happened with some of those turquoise inks in the past on some videos. Here we have another ink named for a movie that has inappropriate relations between siblings on a beach. But the ink is a cool feeling tone that does vary slightly by pen. Only slightly. It also gives a decent amount of shading. As a general rule of expectation after having used it, I think if turquoise is really your thing, then you're kind of missing out if you're not trying this ink. It's really very interesting, and that coming from someone that turquoise is really not my thing. It's not what I run to. But when I see this, it's fairly interesting. The other thing that really does stand out is the swatch for me was much darker than I got in the writing. So that's why I don't really rely on swatches so much. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pilot E95S with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a nice blue-leaning turquoise, and I'm going to probably use turquoise and blue interchangeably here. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get some very nice shading through this. And you see it in just about every word. It's almost easier to point out the words we don't have it, like on the top line, seems, or on the second line, and I think that's it. Nope. On the bottom line, you're going to see same. Those are the words that don't have shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get shading in every single word. And it really goes from that turquoise or lighter blue to a much darker, it's turquoise, but it's a very firm, solid blue as a tone there. Very nice to look at, honestly. Looking at the stub nib, what we get is a tone about what we had with the fine, which was a little bit lighter than we have in the last one with the broad. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get the shading as a absolute standout beast. It looks very nice. I'm not used to seeing a lot of inks really shade this well anymore, unless they're a green or a brown, sometimes a yellow. All right, there's a few that do it, and this one is one. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem. To have a range of experience, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtturm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get roughly the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine with the fine. And we get no feather, we get no spread, we do get some lighter points of shading that are going on. Take a look at the top line, the word further, where you see it starts a little darker, works its way lighter, works its way darker again. Even the word than right next to it starts lighter and gets darker. It's doing very well on a more absorbent paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is roughly the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get some great shading, and with that, I'm going to draw your attention to the word difficulty on the top line. It looks like there may be just a little bit of some haloing that's going on, which is an absolute shock considering this paper. It's not something I really mention much anymore, because why bother pointing out that it's never there? It's doing very well. Awesome job. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread. Do we get shading? Yes, but not as good as we had with the broad. It does shade especially well. You see it on the second line in flourish. You see it in third, or flexion, you see it in third. It's there, it's just not as nice as we were seeing with the broad. It's more like a thicker representation of what we saw with the fine. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, we have no problem. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, it's noticeable that this is lighter than we've seen with the previous writing samples. The paper is having some effect on that. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. Technically, there's a couple of moments of shading that do show up, although not really very much at all. I wouldn't count on this for shading on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. There is a tiny bit of feathering that you see right in that top line, that word, mathematicians. Definitely there. You see it on the fourth line, little, when I get to it. Be patient, everybody. It's going to be there. There is some feathering. It's not out of control. The spread, not there. The shading, not there either. Ran off with the spread. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine and with the medium. Definitely performing much better than it did with the broad. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We're not getting any shading. We're just getting a solid tone, solid writing experience. If this is the color you're after, then this would be perfect. If you're looking for some of those other features with it, then perhaps a stub nib on this paper is not the best way to go. Looking at the back of the page, you see on the stub, there's a couple spots where it looks like it would have come through. It did not come through and touch the page underneath, and you can easily use the back of the page because there's no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get a little bit lighter a tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, about the same tone that we had with the last paper. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get almost no shading. We do get it to show itself a couple times, meaning it could happen. Definitely not happening here. You see it in there on the third line. You see it in constantly on the second line. The word constantly, not as in constantly the whole second line. Looking at the broad nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get the shading back. It really does start to come back here without any kind of problems and does it well. Makes me wonder what was going on with the fine nib. I want to blame the pen because, you know, Lamy, no, it's a great pen. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely shading much better here. It's just hidden in the fine. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread. We are getting some of that shading, giving us the idea that the fine nib is really just hiding some of the shading here. Perhaps it was there. Can always rewind and look again. I'm looking on the paper as I'm saying it, and I'm not seeing it very stand out, so I just don't think it was really happening. Though it does seem to happen with the other pens, so with this paper, you may be able to count on some shading. Bonus, reporter. Looking at the back of the page, you see the ghosting is way under control. Not any kind of problem. You can easily use the back of the page, and there is no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman number 24. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Point Park Fountain Turquoise. Here is Callifolio Botany Bay. Here is Diatramentis Mint Turquoise.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the last paper. We get tiny feathers, but way under control. We get spread, which to me is much more than I would really want to see on it. But it is spreading. I guess you could use it if you had to. It is giving a couple of moments of shading that are going to happen. You're going to see it in infinitesimals in the top line. You're going to see it show up as that in the third line. Infinity in the fourth line, so it's definitely there. Looking at the broad nib, we have very much the same tone that we had with the fine. We are getting a little bit of feathering, but it's under control. We're getting a little bit of spread. Again, I'm going to call it under control. We're getting shading, and I think the shading's coming through better than it did on the fine. We've seen this happen before, and it's happened again. It is deja vu. Looking at the stub nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the fine and the broad. We are getting the tiniest bit of feathering, really not any kind of a problem, to be honest. There is spread. The spread here is more of a problem than the feathering, in my opinion. There is some shading going on. You're going to see it in infinity in the third line. You're going to see it in problem in the second one, goal in the first. So it's there. The spread's the problem. Looking at the page underneath, you see that there's a ton of circling I did because it came through and crushed a lot of that paper. Now, you can't use the next page and you can't use the back of the page. Definitely a problem. I only get to use every other page from this notebook.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here is a red ink by Diatramentis, their Dante Alighieri or Ruby Red. Here is an orange ink by Tag, their Cairo Eero Moonlight of Higashiyama. Here is a magenta ink by Noodlers, their Nightshade. Here is a yellow ink by Krishna, their Freedom Gold.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get a very light turquoise. It's readable, it feathers, it spreads, it doesn't look particularly good. You could use it if you really wanted to. I wouldn't. It doesn't shade. It doesn't look particularly appealing as a tone. But it writes. Looking at the broad nib, we're getting roughly the same tone that we had with the fine. It feathers, yes. It spreads, yes. It shades slightly, but the good news is it will achieve total inner enlightenment the moment of its death on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the fine and the broad. It feathers, but the feathering is pretty under control. I actually think it's feathering less than it did with the broad. It does spread. I think it's spreading less than we had with the last paper. There are moments of shading. And with that, I'm going to say that when that happens on this paper, it sometimes makes me nervous on what the other side looks like. Looking at the page underneath, you see a ton of circling that I did, which means this is not good for the next page. Looking at the back of the page, you understand why with the extreme amount of ghosting and bleeding that this paper is having.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The thicker line of a wet broad will deliver a great tone with excellent shading. Now, you may be able to get this to pass in that professional environment because of its blue lean. And if you want to do that, then make sure that you're using a wet fine. And then you're probably going to be able to get away with it without a problem. Watch out for that yellow paper, though. Don't do that because then they're going to think you're writing with a green.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.